In 1944, at the height of the Second World War, the United States military was preparing for an invasion of Taiwan. Its code name was Operation Causeway, and Formosa, as the island was called at the time, was an important outpost of the Japanese Imperial Army. The US at the time had a standing force of more than 10 million soldiers. It had successfully pulled off the Normandy landing, the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it had numerical and technological superiority over the Japanese. But in the end, they decided to call the invasion off, because the world's most powerful military decided that it was just too difficult. Today, we often talk about the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, whether they'll do it and what it might look like, but we often forget that doing so would mean pulling off one of the most difficult military operations in history. One that even the US didn't want to go through, and one that would be much, much more complicated today than it was back then. But why exactly is invading Taiwan so difficult? Well, to find out, I spoke with someone who knows more than anyone else about this. A retired colonel of the US Marines who conducted the biggest public war game playing out what the invasion would look like.
We developed a war game that simulated a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. We ran 25 iterations in about a dozen different scenarios.
So, let's take a look. So, unlike with the invasion of Ukraine, for example, where the Russians literally had to just step over the border to begin, the first problem is that Taiwan is obviously an island. And that makes it already pretty difficult. For context, in Normandy, the Allies landed 800,000 soldiers over the course of 3 weeks, and on more than 7,000 ships. For an invasion of Taiwan, China would probably need close to 2 million soldiers, which, by the way, is almost the size of its entire armed forces. And so the first challenge is to get all of them there. And that's a lot more difficult than it seems. First, the distance between the Chinese mainland and the island is bigger than most people realize. At its narrowest point, the Taiwan Strait is around 80 miles or 130 kilometers wide, and you have two options to get across, by air or by sea. The much faster option is to do it by air, but your ability to do so is actually extremely limited. Realistically, even the Chinese Air Force could only transport a few thousand troops at most, and only a limited amount of equipment and supplies. There is no way anyone can transport 2 million people, plus an incredible amount of heavy equipment, ammunition, food, fuel, and other supplies by air. Plus, the airlifts will be very vulnerable to Taiwanese Air Force and air defense while on the way. And so the only real option of getting the invasion force across is by sea. And that's where the first problem begins. For most of the year, the Taiwan Strait actually has really difficult sea and weather conditions. With torrential winds, typhoons, large waves, a lot of fog, and often unpredictable extreme weather events, the invasion is actually only possible during two relatively short windows of time, when the weather is calmer, from late March to the end of April, and from late September to the end of October. So from the beginning, China is pretty limited as to when the invasion can happen, and that makes it much less likely to be a surprise. Now, of course, you might say that large modern military ships can deal with even pretty bad weather, like in the Taiwan Strait, and that's true. But that's not what the invasion force would actually mostly consist of. The problem is that China still doesn't actually have enough of those to fit the entire invasion force. And even though it's building a lot of military ships at a really fast pace, it wouldn't really have them ready by 2027, when it's supposed to be ready to invade. And so China will almost certainly have to use smaller civilian ferries to get the 2 million people and all the equipment across. And those are not equipped for bad weather nearly as well as the large military ones. And that's when the other problem emerges. Even in good conditions, crossing the strait by sea takes about 8 to 10 hours. And while this will be happening, the massive invasion fleet will be extremely vulnerable, and especially the civilian ferries carrying much of the load.
The amphibious ships are the center of gravity, the key element, because if they get destroyed, then regardless of what other capabilities the Chinese have, they cannot get forces onto Taiwan, and they lose.
While the Chinese military would likely do as much as it could to protect them, there will be a large time window when they will be sitting ducks. And Taiwan and any other country that will take part in the fight will have a lot of time to take out as much of the invasion force as possible.
The games were typically a race between U.S. efforts to destroy Chinese amphibious ships and the Chinese efforts to land forces on the island and take over a port or airfield to bring in more forces. They typically lost that race because the United States was able to get at the Chinese amphibious ships, but that came at very high cost as they kept on.
Hours before it would even get to Taiwan, the Chinese military would likely have casualties higher than the US had in all the wars in the past decades combined. And that's where all the problems are still just beginning. So let's say that most of the invasion fleet survives. Maybe the Chinese Navy is better than we thought, or the US just hesitated and didn't act in time. And now the Chinese fleet is actually getting to the island. But here comes the next issue, because you need somewhere to land, and you need beaches or ports with deep enough water and large enough to accommodate a massive invasion fleet. And there's very few places on the island where you can actually do that. Most of the west coast of Taiwan, the one that's facing China, has shallow waters around most of its beaches, while the east coast is mostly made up of cliffs, rocks, steep shores, and inaccessible terrain, not suitable for landing hundreds of thousands of troops and tanks. So what you're left with is a few places in the north and the south. For China, by far the best place to land would be in the north, because that's where the capital city is, and it would make conquering the capital a lot easier. But that's exactly why that's quite unlikely to happen.
The Chinese landed in the south, not the north. The north, of course, has the capital and many of the large cities and much of the industry, but the Taiwanese have most of their combat power in the north, so the Chinese tended to land in the south where it was easier to get ashore. A couple of times the Chinese player tried to land in the north, it was very difficult to establish themselves. So they land in the south and then they try to build up combat capability there.
The Taiwanese would know that landing in the north is not something they can afford, and so they would likely destroy its own ports there, including the one in Taipei, to make it inaccessible for anyone. And even if the Chinese military did manage to land at a beach in the north, getting to Taipei City would be enormously difficult, because the city itself sits in a bowl surrounded by mountains, and if the defending forces would blow up the port and the tunnels leading to the city, they would make access into it extremely difficult. And so most likely, China would have to land the bulk of its invasion force in the south, in one of the few beaches that are available for it, and that would be well prepared for their landing, and they would likely face mines, barricades, bunkers, and a lot of resistance. Anyone who has seen the landing scene from Saving Private Ryan can kind of imagine what that might look like, but likely it would be much worse. But let's say it works. They get across the strait, suppress the resistance, and land enough people and equipment on the beaches in the south to create a beachhead, which can then be supplied and from which they can push forward. What then? Well, invasions don't really work if you just end up stuck on a beach, and so in order for China to really gain control, they would have to overtake the major population centers, and especially the capital city, Taipei, including all the governmental institutions that are there. And that's not going to be easy. First, the east coast of the island is basically made up of mountains and forests, one of the most difficult terrains to fight in. The Taiwanese military will have the advantage of knowing the terrain and the environment, and having years to prepare their defenses. And so, pushing through this area would be nearly suicidal for the Chinese forces. And so, they would have to take the west coast route, which is where most of the Taiwanese cities and towns are. And that would mean a lot of urban combat, which is once again notoriously difficult, and it would necessarily result in a lot of civilian casualties, which is not great for getting the local population on your side. Taiwan itself has a fairly well-trained and well-equipped professional military force of around 180,000 men, plus almost 2 million reservists. Now, there are big doubts about the state of its reserve force and how many of them would actually be combat ready if needed, and also about whether the Taiwan military has the equipment they actually need, or whether they have been just buying Abrams tanks because they look cool. But it's likely that despite all of this, the Taiwanese military will still put up enough resistance to make this very difficult. Unless the Taiwanese military would give up immediately, the invasion would mean incredible costs for the invading force. It would take a long time and it would incur massive civilian losses, and an overwhelming destruction of infrastructure, including the targets that the Chinese would like to obtain intact, like the chip-producing factories. But, despite all of this, all of the public war games that have been conducted clearly show one thing. If Taiwan would be left to face the Chinese invasion alone, if no one, and especially the US, would join the fight against China, and the PLA would basically have unlimited amount of time to do it, eventually the Taiwanese would lose, overwhelmed by the Chinese superiority in numbers and resources. But if the US does join the fight, the situation looks very different. The Chinese losses would increase exponentially, and China would likely suffer so much economic and military damage before being able to finish the invasion that it would shift the odds of success from incredibly difficult to almost impossible.
The results of the war game were that the United States and its coalition could sustain autonomous and democratic Taiwan, but it came at very high cost. The United States and the coalition lost dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of personnel. The Taiwanese economy is wrecked, and the U.S. global position would be affected for many years. But the Chinese lost heavily, and the scale of their losses might endanger the stability of the Chinese Communist Party.
So, objectively speaking, it looks like despite the enormous investments into its military in the past decades, China is still not in a position where it would have any reason to think that it should succeed in conducting an open, full-scale invasion, in case the US would join the fight. But does that mean that it will not happen? Well, definitely not. Because even if the Chinese generals don't think it can be done, at the end of the day, it's the politicians who decide about these things. And they might very well decide to go ahead anyway. When Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he didn't think that it will turn into a war that will last several years and cost him hundreds of thousands of soldiers, because no one was willing to tell him what the reality on the ground looked like, how badly prepared the Russian military was, or how willing to fight the Ukrainians were. And that's something that inherently happens in all authoritarian regimes, where no one wants to give the boss the bad news. And that's what could easily happen in China as well, and how even an invasion that no one believes could succeed might happen anyway.